Puget Sound is an urban sea that's located in Washington State along the west coast, so near the Pacific. And it's connected to the Pacific Ocean through the West Strait of San Juan de Fuca. Over here to the north, we have the Strait of Georgia. The combined waters of Puget Sound and the Strait of Georgia make the Salish Sea. But the part that is in the U.S. is what we call Puget Sound, and it's divided in several basins with different ecological characteristics. So the interesting thing about Puget Sound is when you see all these beautiful natural environments, and it seems like it's a very pristine system. But in reality, it is an urban sea. It's highly developed. Its coastline has been extensively modified. And there's a lot of effects that have come from that extensive modification. For example, increased ship traffic, increased pollution, non-point source pollution, but also toxics in the sediments and the water of Puget Sound. And those are having an effect on the wildlife, for example, orcas that we see here. And that effect has caused something on this, has had an important effect on the salmon population, which is that juvenile salmon are dying in Puget Sound. And salmon are very important in Puget Sound, both ecologically and culturally. So there is a project that was started to try to understand what are the causes of this early marine mortality called the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project. And it was looking at a variety of different impacts from river flow, estuaries, hatcheries, food supply, contaminants, predation, and disease. And it's within this context that we built the Atlantis model for Puget Sound. The technical memorandum that describes the model is currently in press. And the model has, it simulates the different human activities that happen within the three-dimensional structure of Puget Sound. And I'm going to talk more about the food web, the biogeochemistry, and the different components. So oceanographic forcing is from a high-resolution realistical numerical simulation of the Salish Sea, or a ROMS model. That here we could see what that looks like. And then we converted those fields into temperature and salinity to drive the different process in Atlantis within this geographical configuration that here we can see there's a lot of islands, which are the gray polygons. And then the other polygons are colored by depth. So it's not a very deep system compared to other places. So it's it goes up to 350 meters in the model. And there's a lot of shallower polygons. The Atlantis model has 73 functional groups. 4 of those are primary producers, zooplankton, 12 invertebrates. We have 21 salmon groups because the focus of the model was to understand what was happening to salmon populations. Feature of this model is that it uses a special subroutine to simulate the anadromous life history of salmon, and I'm going to talk more about that. But it also has some other fish species like the mussel, rockfish, some pelagic and forage species, particularly I want to highlight herring. There's also seabirds, variety of marine mammals, including orcas or killer whales, and elasmobranchs. As I mentioned, salmon life history is represented in detail. So salmon are born in rivers upstream. At some point, they move from this river larval stage into a juvenile stage into marine waters, where they can spend several months in that juvenile stage before moving into the Pacific Ocean stage. And this is for non-resident fish. There are some fish that stay in marine waters in here, but and we do simulate those. But in general, they move out and they go from juveniles to adults out in the Pacific Ocean, and they spend 3 to 5 years out there, and then they come back into Puget Sound as adults, and they can spend several months before they go back upriver in this called the river reproduction stage, where they spawn and then they die. So this is the anadromous life history that the model simulates. The green parts, the juvenile stage and the adult stage, are the parts of the life history that are simulated explicitly within the model because it's within Puget Sound, it's a marine area. The blue parts are simulated implicitly. You can think of they're just these black boxes where these processes are happening. So we represent both wild and hatchery populations, and there are 11 populations of Chinook salmon, 4 coho, and 3 chum. And then we also have pink salmon, sockeye, what we are the Canadian salmonids, which is just the Fraser River Chinook. So all these functional groups are representing populations of ecological or economic importance. And as I mentioned, there's also these hatchery groups that are stocked from farms, but they're also pretty important. The food web in the model is based on diet proportions. So we took all available data going back multiple years for so historical data and different data sources. So not only stomach contents, but also looking at stable isotopes and diet proportions. And we use the statistical analysis developed by Cam Ainsworth for the Gulf of Mexico to obtain statistical distributions that describe the maximum likelihood of those diets. So here you can see the different nodes are colored in colors depending on the guild, and those are each of the different functional groups. So you can see there's a lot of interconnections in Puget Sound. So as I mentioned, the diets were gathered from historical data. So this is an example for the marine mammals. So you could see that some of the different groups that are part of the diet. So this is just an example of what a diet composition looks like. The spatial distribution for the different functional groups could be seasonal or monthly, and it was derived on surveys. And we either chose seasonality or seasonal or monthly distribution, depending on how in detail we wanted to describe those groups in the model. So for example, all the salmon are monthly, because given their life history, we really need to represent what happens monthly and how they come in and out of the model. And we use a geostatistical modeling approach called VAST, developed by Jim Thorson at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, to derive these spatial distributions using different types of survey data. And this is just an example of a Chinook functional group. We also include fisheries in the model, both commercial and recreational catch. And what we did is we made a historical reconstruction to look at all the catch between 2009 and 2019. And then we use the most recent years to describe what the fishing fleets are in our model based on the ones that are still occurring and what they're fishing. And we have 60 different fleets. And one reason we have so many fleets is that we wanted to separate salmon from everything else, but we also wanted, because of the way the management happens, we wanted to separate tribal versus non-tribal fisheries. And also because thinking in the long run that when if we look at scenarios regarding fisheries, that distinction is going to be important. The model was calibrated using that historical catch time series that we developed. This is a summary over here, just some of the major groups, what those trajectories look like. So here in this figure, I'm showing you biomass in blue and catch in orange for some fish functional groups. And this is from 1970 to 2010. So what we did is we used an approach where we had this historical time series. So we created what we can thought of a historical Atlantis model that started in 1970. And we used that historical catch time series to drive the model forward to what we call the present day, as 2011. And we tried to make sure that following a spin-up period of 30 years with no fishing to ramp up the biomass, that then we applied this fisheries catch, and that our groups are able to reproduce the necessary biomass to sustain catch as found in this historical time series. So that's one way that we tried to calibrate the different parameters in the model and make sure that we were able to represent history. So one thing we did find is that in many cases we were unable to, that our groups could not sustain that fisheries catch that was in historical data. And that's probably because the conditions in Puget Sound have changed so much, and we just don't have accurate data of what the real biomass of certain groups, especially base groups, invertebrate groups, zooplankton, even some fish like herring, we don't really know what the actual biomass was. And the system has changed so much that our biomass initial conditions, which were based on more current data, really don't approximate 30, 40 years ago. But it was a very useful exercise to have done this historical calibration and historical finning. And it helped us tune and calibrate the parameters in the model, such that we use the resulting model files as our present day model. So for 2011, after it had been calibrated for all the usual model aspects and for this catch history. So one important thing about our model is that we found that it shows a strong trophic linkage between herring population dynamics and salmon abundance. So for example, here, when we have low herring abundance, and the model has two different functional groups for two different populations of Pacific herring. So if the herring crashes, we have the different salmon populations that persist, but they actually persist at low levels compared to when these two herring populations have high abundance. The abundance of salmon increases 2 to 4-fold. And that's something that we found throughout our calibration and have we found throughout all the different simulations that we did to calibrate, that there really was this very strong linkage that came from all the ecological and diet data. So what are we doing currently with the model? We are testing expert rank potential hypothesis of salmon survival. So going back to that initial diagram that I showed you as part of the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project, we looked at different driver types. So in brown are drivers that are fall into competition, light green is predation, brown is pollution, and dark green is food supply. So we're testing a range of hypotheses and see how they're affecting, what was probably the relative impact in affecting salmon survival. Again, we can't really look to the past to see what happened. We can't simulate it, but we can just look at the relative impact of these factors in our model. Another thing that we're looking at is we are evaluating the ecosystem level and economic impacts of recovery actions for southern resident killer whales. So southern resident killer whales are a population that's comes back to Puget Sound around twice a year. They're endangered, they're protected, and there's a whole series of management measures that were directed to try to increase the population, decrease competition, and increase prey availability. But these recommendations don't consider taking into account the rest of the system or what those consequences could be. We're also looking at cumulative impacts. And then we have a separate outside of Atlantis economic analysis to look at the effects of these regulations on whale watching specifically. And we're collaborating with the CSIRO team and researchers in Canada to use their Salish Sea model as part of an ensemble approach to look at the impact of these scenarios. Finally, the Atlantis model for Puget Sound will be part of a multimodal platform to understand processes across the whole basin, and land to sea interface, where we couple with an oceanographic model, the Salish sea model, that provides ocean circulation and biogeochemistry that then we can use to drive Atlantis. And then also a watershed model that describes the effects of climate and land use, so that we can have a complete perspective of what's happening in Puget Sound. And finally, our model applications will contribute to measures of ecosystem health of Puget Sound. Thank you.